please. Thank you. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the first of a four-part series of quick sessions covering the theme of Zero Trust. I want to thank everyone for coming. My name is Nick Juckoop from Identity Methods. I look after our portfolio of Zero Trust solutions here. And I'm joined by my colleague, Alan Fennick from Color Tokens. They're our key partner for Zero Trust as a service. They've also been working closely with government and NIST to help define some of the standards and principles you'll be hearing about today. And the idea of these 20-minute sessions is really just to give you a brief overview, firstly about the fundamentals and what's being recommended by NIST as an approach to Zero Trust architecture and model. And then future sessions in the coming weeks will cover the main building blocks around visualization, around segmentation, and finally around lockdown. Zero Trust will become a standard for everyone in security, as I know we all agree. So start planning today, I guess, is the key message for this and all the other sessions. So now let's take a look at some of those standards. And at this point, I'll hand you over to Alan, who will run through the NIST principles of a Zero Trust model. Over to you, Alan.
Thanks very much, Nick. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for spending the time today to join us and take a look at these things. So firstly, I just want to run through Zero Trust. We hear about this a lot in the marketplace. It's a buzzword that's commonly used. Today's session, we want to go through a bit more detail around how it came about, why it's important to a lot of strategies moving forward for organizations that are looking to improve their security posture. So there's a few things here that drive the adoption of Zero Trust. Firstly is compliance. So we see a lot of businesses are under strict control mechanisms, either via standards such as PCI, SWIFT in the banking industry, High Trust, for example, Cyber Essentials. They're all driving organizations to take a look at the next phase in securing your architectures and infrastructure and users. So today's focus really is on NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technologies. But we also have other analysts, supporting this message. Most organizations we talk to are having some plan or some idea about how they're going to look at implementing Zero Trust over the next 12 months. So NIST, to give you some background about who they are, if you haven't heard of them, they're effectively a government standard laboratory based over in the US that were established actually over a century ago. And they do various different things in their labs. They look at science and technology overall, engineering, but equally they look at information technology standards as well. What they've done over the last year or so is develop a standard for this Zero Trust architecture. And this is actually published, it's available online as document 800-207, and we'll provide links to this later on in the presentation. But there's two kind of distinct areas of Zero Trust that they zoom in and focus on, and it's making access control more granular. So at the moment, different setups have different levels of access and controls of those access methods, across their whole infrastructure. But what they're really zooming in on here is how we allow, policy detection points or policy enforcement points to move as close to that resource as possible. So this outlines in their document some of the best standards and approaches for doing that. So Color Tokens ourselves, we've worked very closely with NIST on this particular standard set, and we actually have a member of our board who sits on the NIST standard setup as well. A chap by the name of Tony Scott. So he was actually the formal federal government CIO under the Obama administration. So he was in charge of effectively all of their IT. So huge job. They learned an awful lot in the government sector about what would be the best approaches looking forward to securing all of your users, infrastructures, all of those different areas. Obviously, it's a big minefield. Some people have already taken steps towards this. But now, I guess, over the next 12 months, this buzzword is going to turn much more into a defined set of guiding principles that customers can use as a reference point to start going about improving their security. And I think at this point, it's quite important to highlight that you can't really go out and buy zero trust as one thing. It's not a product, so to speak. There are many people that are looking towards doing this that will use various different tool sets to be able to achieve this kind of standard. But it's a concept rather than necessarily a product. So what's the goal of it? Well, it's really to prevent this unauthorized access, coupled with, access control enforcement, and improving that granularity takes quite a few steps. But, it's a collection of those concepts. Really, it's about least privilege. So if you are assuming that your network will at some point be compromised, how do we go about, driving that information access to the highest possible granular point where only things that need to talk to each other, or least privileged access, actually can talk to each other. In many different structures, once you're actually into the particular organization, people can move and travel laterally across a network, for instance, which exposes that business to more and more risk. So where we are right now, if we look at a lot of deployments and security architectures, it started out with the perimeter firewall. So the perimeter firewall was there for a good purpose. It effectively stopped bad people from coming in from the outside world, but that really was its limit. As we look at, newer flat networks that have been built, what tends to happen is if that perimeter device has been breached, there's little or no control after that point. As we move forward, next generation firewalls can do obviously more intelligent things. They can layer 7 approach some of these challenges. And most people, I think, in generally speaking, are out there at the moment, probably in that zone of having a next gen firewall, but they haven't moved up to the next levels really. And what we're trying to do on both of these access points, or access on here, is drive right up down to the granular level, whether that be a device agent, for instance, or even further up a kernel agent, to try and bring that granularity back down to the workload and make it as close as possible. So zero trust requires really intimate knowledge of your assets. If you take a look at all of the, most people would be able to basically say, I understand how many servers we've got, I understand how many applications I've got, but my CMDB records are not necessarily very robust or up to date. So critically, you need to understand exactly what is happening in real time in your infrastructure. Equally, we need to understand who and what is accessing those assets. How do you have a report? Some people run SIM tools. It's very difficult to have a real-time understanding of all of those access points. And we want to reduce that down to only being applicable to people that are known good. So rather than having open access across the board, we need to start to look at restricting that and make them more dynamic and granular. Policies are based typically on IP addresses. The concept of this is to move away from just using IP addresses to control your security. And equally, we want to stop any lateral movement across the business that is unnecessary. So an example of this may be that someone has access to an HR system, but actually that's the only thing they need to access. However, they have carte blanche network access across the board because that's the way that traditionally things have been set up and designed. And it is very, very complicated in most examples to restrict that, but color tokens do assist with that journey. So with that, I wanted to run through some sample use cases that you may experience out in your estate. So the first is something called separating environments, or environmental separation. So this could be that as you start to look at your development, test, and production systems, you realize that actually they have open connection points between them. And this can be, for various different reasons where people are porting data in and out of those environments. But in terms of regulation, there may be records or pieces of information or PII data that shouldn't be transferable between those environments. So once you start to look at zero trust, you can look at possibly segmenting and restricting access between these environments to prevent any data breaches. The second is ring fencing of applications. So in typical structures, we see that there are possibly revenue generating applications that are more important to the business than, say, something non-valuable in terms of their records that they're holding. So one approach is to be able to say, okay, to begin with, as part of our zero trust journey, we're going to start to look at putting a ring of steel around these particular high value applications. So if we do get breached, then that bad actor is not going to be able to necessarily gain access to those critical assets. And there are some quite interesting statistics in terms of if people do break into your network and they do gain access, the dwell time can be essentially months before they are detected or understood to have breached that perimeter. So there is risk involved with having an open network once someone does break through that barrier. And the second point is that, or third point, sorry, is that across the board we see so many different transformations happening. A lot of businesses are running things in cloud, some are running them on-prem, or they have a mixture of both. So that security posture really needs to traverse across all of those particular environments, which can be quite complex to do if you're in a position where you are migrating to the cloud or you're trying to transform more and more apps into that space. So you need to be able to take control from an overarching point of view of all of those security components under one banner, which obviously can be very complicated with traditional tool sets. And the next point that I want to highlight is obviously about endpoint and user. And I think over the last 12 months, this has really become a high priority for business for obvious reasons due to things like COVID, where the perimeter of security used to be more centric around office users that weren't out on public networks. Now what we see is obviously with the advent of more and more people working remotely, the perimeter is now actually someone's house potentially, or a coffee shop, or somewhere else which is on a public domain. So as part of this, we have to understand how we go about securing all of these elements and making sure that only privileged access is allowed. So with that, I wanted to talk about the implementation steps that we take with Zero Trust. So the first thing is to identify and visualize those assets. So visualization basically means how do we get a real-time visibility of all of those assets and how they are talking to each other and communicating. And once we have that, we need to understand their dependencies on each other. So for instance, we wouldn't be able to go about locking down an infrastructure that easily if we didn't have a full map and be able to understand exactly all of those communication points in real time. If we did use a traditional approach such as a firewall, that can be very dangerous and difficult to implement if you don't understand how things are talking to each other. And I think many of us have been in a position where we've gone about making security or firewall changes that were very difficult to implement without probably some impact to service. So we want to reduce that as much as possible in terms of downtime and so on. And also we want to prevent that lateral movement. We also want to know, the design of the known good for both your crown jewel applications, high value applications, and the lateral movements between those functions and sections. So these are the recommended steps from NIST specifically. We also want to convert policies to be dynamic as well, where they follow the workload regardless of where their location is or if they move. Many applications are spread across multiple data centers now for high availability reasons. And a lot of them are dynamic in nature, where they are spun up and down periodically. And that means that security posture must follow those dynamic elements. And we want to make sure that obviously we deploy these with absolutely zero downtime. That's complex to achieve in most traditional architectures. And equally, if we do make changes or support that change process within an organization, it must also follow that as well. So these are the real key principles of Zero Trust. In the following sessions, we'll be discussing in more detail how we can go about visualization, how we can go about enforcement, and equally how we can go about essentially segmentation of your network as well. So that concludes today's session. I'm just going to hand back over to Nick to finish off. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. That's, I think, a perfect introduction on where to start with Zero Trust. And as we've mentioned, I think color tokens are probably best placed, having worked closely with NIST around these standards. So, and we also appreciate that everyone here may be at a different starting point. So it's good to understand, the foundations of it first. So just to recap, what we spoke about today, we covered off the drivers to Zero Trust, largely around compliance, things like PCI and Cyber Essentials, to name a couple. Then we went on to talk about some of the key attributes, making access control as granular as possible, and with the policies and the execution of those policies, moving closer to the resource. And I think we also showed the strength of Zero Trust architecture as it moves from a perimeter-based security all the way up to the strongest levels of the kernel agent. And then we kind of just rounded things off, as Alan said, with the 6 steps. And a lot of those 6 steps you're going to see in future sessions. So the first of which will be visualization, same time next week. In the meantime, I'd like to again thank Alan for presenting here today, and all of you for attending. Enjoy your weekend, and we'll see you again same time next week. Many thanks.
Thanks, everyone.